The relationship to the body is often a thorny subject, the so-called magical products promising to rejuvenate our skin, to the diet selling immediate virtues for our appearance. In reality, nothing is more social. This is the words of the philosopher Margaux Cassan. For Tricolor, she presents these two books published by Creuset. One on Naturism, Naked Liver, which promotes among other things the absence of clothes, the other, Ultraviolet, more recent, on the use of tanning in a dynamic of social distinction. Hello Margaux Cassan.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. To begin with, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, in a rather scholarly way, Margaux Cassan. I am 27 years old. I am a training philosopher. I specialized initially on the philosophy of religions, and I was interested in Christian anarchism. And now I publish books that deal more with the philosophy of the body, so Naturism, the relationship to the skin. And then I work in Brussels in a geopolitical institute on the questions of European identity.
What drives you as a philosopher to write books? Is it a subject that you have at heart and that guides you towards writing, or do you say to yourself, I want to write and therefore I am looking for a subject?
I would say it is both a frustration and a momentum. The frustration is to have read a lot of philosophy, and to realize that many of the themes that affected me in everyday life were not addressed in philosophy. In fact, the central question that all philosophers ask is, what is man? And when they answer, they wisely choose to dig into the soul or metaphysics or moral questions to answer this question, what is man? So man is a being of virtue, man is a political being, man is a free being. But all the questions that touch the body are questions that are either not addressed or addressed with contempt. Because in the philosophical tradition, the one that has prevailed for a long time, Plato, is dualism. So, a very strong split between the mind and the body, with the idea that on the side of the mind we have everything that is pure, and then on the side of the body, everything that is of the order of desires, of the city, and therefore of the way of questioning. Man, which would be more futile, lighter. And so I write with the opposite postulate, that is to say that I leave the body, the flesh, the skin, to also answer philosophical questions. What is man? But suddenly, with a literary treatment, because when we talk about the body, we are obliged to have an embodied writing. And for that, the somewhat arid writing of the simple philosophical essay does not allow, in fact, in my opinion, to answer the questions of the body in an exhaustive way, which implies having a play, a narration, a sensitivity.
So you just published Ultraviolet, where you explore the relationship we have to our skin, through tanning in particular. You said that you were doing a work of narration, based on the experience of your mother and you, your mother who had a melanoma. You therefore ask yourself about tanning and what it represents. In what, according to you, you often use this expression, tanning is a cultural revolution?
Yes, because tanning has a history, at least in the West, which is a very dense history because it is very recent. So, the cultural revolution of tanning, which I can develop a little later, is historically dated in the West, and in particular in France, from the 1930s. And in particular, I would say, from the time I paid, so from 1936, to the beginning of tanning, that is to say, the 90s 2000s. And during this phase, which is actually in the history of humanity a very short phase, tanning had a form of hype, but which does not explain itself for simple reasons, precisely aesthetic or related to beauty, since the history of beauty is always linked to social, sociological, societal, political conquests, and therefore, in my opinion, a much wider universal dimension, and which has to do with philosophical questions, metaphysics, the religious relationship, etc. And in this case, what happened, the shift that took place around the 1930s, is that before, Western societies were still governed by a Christian imaginary, and that in the Christian imaginary, whiteness is associated with the ideal of virtue, purity, virginity, etc. And so there are a few things that play in parallel and in favor of tanning. The first is the secularization of society. So first, in 1905, the separation of the church and the state, and then later, a secularization of society and not just spheres of power. So the religious imaginary is no longer the dominant imaginary. And also, with social conquests and in particular paid leave, holidays become a really strong socioeconomic claim. And so before that, those who were tanned were those who worked in the fields, so they came from the working class, so tanning was rather discredited. And suddenly, the one who is tanned is the worker who has the chance to go on vacation because he has conquered this right to laziness, which we talked about recently in the media.
So, as you say, the halo of the skin is a key to reading class relations, in fact, and logic of distinction. How does this materialize today with, in particular, immigration, which means that we live in a more and more multicultural society where skin colors are different? How is it going to be embodied?
Well, while writing the text, I asked myself a question at one point, which was, is it a white book? In fact, is tanning a subject for whites and therefore excluded? So yes and no. First of all, no, because even tanned black skin does not ask this question anyway. But indeed, the notion of mutation, therefore of color change and almost even of skin nature, is rather a Western question and of white color. But in fact, when we look at the scale of the world, what happens in relation to skin, we realize that the logic behind tanning, that is to say, the logic of metamorphosis, of mutation, and the logic of distinction that you have addressed, is universal. For example, in Korea, even if we can say that it is the opposite, it is the same logic. To look like a bourgeois, you have to be as pale as possible. And it was the same thing in the 80s in France or in the West. To look like a bourgeois, you had to be as tanned as possible. And so in both cases, in fact, there is a principle of metamorphosis, since man does not accept himself as he is, and that in order to change social class, he must change skin. So I think it's about the same logic.
You use a term that I find fascinating, the sun's rays. We are talking about these people who, in the cultural revolution that you mention, are still looking for more exposure to the sun or UV to tan. What link do you make with this character of Balzac?
The link at the beginning is really Balzac, precisely because the project is a philosophical project, but it is also a literary project behind this book. And I really like the literature of class transfusions, so Balzac is a bit of the first name. And Rastignac is an interesting character, because when we read the Pergorio, we already see that in order to go from one class to another, he uses the body, he uses beauty. Balzac describes him as a dark, dark young man with blue eyes, and who uses his weak side to seduce women from high society and go from one class to another. But the lever that makes him go from one class to another is the lever of seduction and the fact of having carnal relations with women from high society. Then, since Bourdieu, it has changed a bit, so there is also a literature of class transfusions, Annie Arnaud, Duard Louis, etc. But there, the lever is really the lever of language. So the character goes from one class to another because he changes the way he expresses himself. And I found that in literature there was a dead angle, which was these characters who are transfusions, and where the lever is really the skin. And so the Rastignacs of the sun, it qualifies all these people in the 80s who used the skin to achieve, because by changing the color of the skin, they sent a signal of good health, of good minds, of success, of prosperity too. And so it becomes the Rastignacs of the sun.
So, however, you say good health. Unfortunately, this is not always the case with the overexposure. You also make the parallel with the myth of Icarus. Can you explain a little bit how you came to this parallel?
Well, the book, there is also that. I wanted to do a contemporary rewriting of the myth of Icarus because I find that it is both a founding myth and as often it is misunderstood because it is galvanized. Icarus is this character who disobeys his father Daedalus, who tells him, "We are going to leave the labyrinth. I am going to build you wax wings because it is the only way to live. Leave the labyrinth, and so you're going to fly away, you're going to go higher and higher, you're going to be fascinated by the sun, and so be careful, you're going to want to try to touch it or at least approach it. But since your wings are made of wax, if you get close you risk dying since the wax is going to melt, and so you're going to fall. And that's exactly what Icarus does. He disobeys his father, and his wings melt, and he falls into the sea, which today is called the Icarian Sea. And when we look, even on the internet, what is the myth of Icarus, moral type of the fables of La Fontaine, etc.? In fact, we always read the same thing. That is to say, man is a being of the breeze. He is too proud, and Icarus was too proud. He wanted to touch the sun, and so he died. But in fact, we can read like Consponville, which I saw you received, who wrote a great text on Icarus. We can see the character of Icarus, not like the character of good cop, bad cop, and tell him it's not good, but like a character of ascension precisely, like a character in fact characteristic of these. Consponville says the ascending materialism, but that's exactly it. These are characters who have a trajectory of ascension, and who also simply qualify man. Man is someone who seeks to build himself, in fact, and who exists only in this construction a little of ascension. That's how he builds his identity. And so I tried to make Icarus a figure a little more ambivalent, and also in a certain way to sublimate it.
How will our awareness of the health risks of exposure to the sun change this taste for tanning? How does the awareness that I have of the risks change the taste for tanning? Your awareness, but even the most general one in society now, there are sanitary campaigns, there is overall everyone has in mind the fact that too much sun equals risks for health. Does it change anyway today? Because if I continue a little what I had in mind, I was looking at, you mentioned in particular Sigella, but when we look at Sigella today, he is still quite tanned, he still uses tanning. Jean d'Ormesson before his death still kept that tan side.
Yes, but they have an anachronistic side precisely. Anachronistic, because I believe a lot in the power of the imaginary, and I know that suddenly people like Seguela or like my mother or like Dormesson, in the 80s when we thought sun, in fact there is the whole question of the lexical field which for me is always important because it is quite revealing of the imaginary. In the 80s, sun was CS. Exenson, there was the film Les Bronzes, which was released in 78, where all the cool characters were actually Les Bronze, and Michel Blanc, who in the film is very pale and the one who is the object of mockery on the part of others. And there is also the song of Gainsbourg, C.S. Exenson, so it is an imaginary of hedonism, positive, entirely positive and associated with beauty, with prosperity. Today, when we think of the sun, the first thing we think of is skin aging, skin cancer, and potentially even, I would say the heat wave. Climate change, so this deadly pattern is quite recent, but I think it is very prevalent, and therefore it also changes the relationship we have with beauty, since today we know, for example, when we are a woman or a man, that if we expose ourselves too young, well, we are going to be ridiculed, and so we go back a little to the ideal of beauty, which was the one before paid leave, but for reasons this time which are more religious but which are precisely linked to secularization. That is to say that today, we have a relationship, men with death, which has become more and more frivolous. We accept less and less the very idea of dying, and therefore the idea of aging, and we associate the pale skin with a form of longevity, so it becomes the new beauty.
So precisely, so I bounce back on what you were saying. We know that with the question of seasonal depressions it is important to still have this vitamin D from the sun. Conversely, too much sun creates cancers, melanomas. We have the impression that in the history of the last 150 years there has been a binary choice between tanning and pale skin. Does that say something about man on his taste for excess?
Yeah, well, that's it. All white or all black, that's a bit the expression. Yes, so as much as philosophers have despised the questions of the body, as much if they have an obsession, It is precisely the relationship of man to excess. Already in Aristotle, virtue is associated with the right environment. When you use Pascal, it is the same. The definition of virtue is temperance, so it is wrongly attributed to the somewhat natural tendency of man, which is the tendency to lust, and which is the one denounced by most commentators of Icarus. So it is true that from this point of view it defines us very well.
So in this book you ask the question of the relationship to the body, but you had already done it in Live Naked. You talk about your personal experience and your encounter with naturism. Can you explain to us how you got into naturism at a very young age? Well, quite simply through my family.
My uncle and my aunt, who now live in Laon, in a naturist village, brought me there when I was little, and then I spent all my summers there, all my holidays, and since I was 18, I decided to go there alone, so I had a somewhat classic naturist journey. That is to say, through inheritance and transmission. It is still a rather minority movement, so we rarely get there by chance. And the project of living naked was a very simple project, in fact, which consisted of answering all the little sentences that I heard when I said I am a naturist. And these sentences were, but in fact it is a thing of ass, or it is a pudic, or it is an old thing. In short, I had the impression that there was a form of ignorance around this movement, and above all, a more serious one in my opinion, a form of depoliticization of what naturism was. Naturism was reduced to its leisure side, all naked, while there is a history of naturism that is closely linked to the history of anarchism, since the naturist movement was created by anarchists at the end of the 19th century. At the time of the development of the industrial era, so it was a hyper-political movement where people started to undress, precisely because they said to themselves, with industrialization, they realized that there was more and more social inequality. And at one point, in the anarchist meetings, they said to themselves, how are we going to make the priest be able to speak equally with the miller worker, and that the miller worker can speak equally with the woman who is, I don't know, a seamstress? And that the seamstress can speak equally with the master of works, for example. And they said to themselves, in fact, the costume, precisely the costume of the priest, the costume of the master of works, creates an authority relationship, and if we remove their costume, how would they speak to us? Well, they would speak to us just from man to man or from woman to woman. And so this idea of undressing was a really political idea. A form of radical communism. And that's what I really experienced in the naturist villages, and that I found interesting to develop, also because we are in societies where, in general, the utopia is a bit decried, because the utopias of the last century have made a lot of deaths, so the very idea of claiming a utopia is still connoted negatively, and worse, the utopias of the community and the utopias of equality, because they are associated, even if I make a big difference, but basically with Stalin, Gulag, communism, etc., Mao, and so today all the utopias that we develop, if we try to develop them, are either hyper-personal utopias, type individual, personal development, etc., or utopias of freedom, and not at all utopias of equality. And I found that there was something to tell and to defend as well.
So it's true that you say, naturism, we think right away, when we think of naturism, we think of nudity, but it's not just that, it's a whole way of life. How is this way of life characterized? How is it, all these facets?
There are several things already. So naturism was founded by friendly and political encounters between anarchists and a bit heterodox doctors, on a common enemy, which was industrialization, basically. For example, industrialization we know. Cars, trains, etc., but before that it was also the pharmaceutical industry. And so in fact, the first anti-vax was already present in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was the agri-food industry, and therefore the beginning of what they call sucrivorism, that is, malnutrition, cellophane meat, etc. So there is a whole series of doctors already at the beginning of the 20th century who started to say there is something going on here and that is not good. It's Marx, religion is the opium of the people, but sugar is also the opium of the people because that's what allows you to buy bad food, which basically is not the right term, but feed, gnaw at multinationals. So that was already felt. And I'm telling you this because it's still present. There is nudity in the naturist imagination, and then anarchists who had this idea that men and women had to live equally, that nudity was a way of allowing that, who were vegetarians for the reasons I explained before, because they thought that more and more we were going to consume meat in an industrial way, and so it was going to feed the industrialists in question, etc. So there is all this ideological, political, and sanitary foundation, which is actually much more important than nudity. The proof is that when you are a naturist, you are not a naturist only in July and August, you are a naturist all year round. And so to be a naturist all year round, there has to be a foundation of values that accompanies it and carries it.
Do naturists today are aware of this story?
Not all of them, actually. And it is also to them that I addressed myself in the text, to give them a serious spirit. And also, I think that for the imaginaries to be transmitted, there has to be a story. Why are we still telling the Bible, the Quran, the Torah today? It's because there is a story. And when there is a story, there is a capacity for transmission. And when you are not aware of your own history, for example, because there is not enough history to be told and transmitted from generation to generation. So there was also this idea behind the text, to give the naturists themselves a story, that was not just even if it's good too, it's nice to be naked and to bathe in cold water. In fact, we come from a social history, we come from an important political history. But even without knowing it, even without having read about the history of naturism, I think it is still internalized.
Yes, precisely. I was going to ask you this question. I was going to ask you what was the motivation of these people to become naturists if they do not know the history of naturism. Is it a taste for practices without understanding where they come from? Because when you learn the philosophy of naturism, you can say to yourself, I totally adhere to it. I totally agree, I want to go towards this movement. But for people who go there without knowing this story, what are their sources of inspiration?
There are several motivations. I think there is a motivation which is simply to be closer to nature, because behind naturism, there is also an ideal of sobriety which is very important. Sobriety is obviously not getting dressed, but it is also consuming less. So we consume simply, we live simply, we are close to nature. This is a research, even without knowing the history of the 19th century, which concerns a lot of people today who live in metropolises, who have bullshit jobs, who do not understand exactly the meaning of their activities. Anyway, this return to sobriety, or, I like this expression, simple life, is quite spontaneous and natural for many people. For women, too, it can be the fact of suffering. For example, when you travel alone, when you are on a beach, you should always be careful. Be a little careful, because you feel in danger. And so it can also be the fact of looking for a form of anonymity, of security, because paradoxically, women are much more secure in naturist villages. So it can be the fact of saying, I absolutely want to be left alone, without being the subject of concupiscent gaze. And so I go to a naturist village because I went there once, and I had the impression that I was not watched, that I could bathe freely, walk freely, etc. There is a lot of that. It can be for people who are complexed, or who are in the same handicap situation, the same issue around the gaze, who have the impression of being stigmatized all the time, shouted at, and having had the story of a friend who told them, I am obese like you, and I went to a naturist village, and for the first time I actually spent holidays without having the impression of being watched. Because the story around the diversity of bodies, it's not just a theory, we really feel it, we see it. There is a diversity of bodies. There is an absence of gaze and judgment that is effective, and which is there even when we don't know that. From the 1930s or even 1920s, naturists welcomed war amputees into their communities, and it was the only way they could accept their bodies. When they came back from the First World War, they had no arms, no legs. Even when we don't know that, we feel it in the present in naturist villages. So the motivations are diverse, and also when the story manages to be transmitted, it is often because we have family, etc.
How do you explain this absence of gaze? Here we make the distinction of seeing, looking. How do you explain that nudity comes to suppress the generalized gaze of one on the other that we actually know in our societies?
Because I think that nudity, which is a group nudity, so that's very important, creates a form of uniformity. It's like, more or less, it gives the same feeling when you are in a naturist village than if you are, I don't know, in a school of war where everyone is in uniform. It smooths in a certain way, and like the way we dress, it says a lot about us. So in fact, what we look at in others is that it's the choices they made, which are choices of distinction. You decided to wear a necklace, you dress, all in black like today, or you have a necklace, you have a piercing. That's what we look at in others. But there is a form of, like the imaginary of the Garden of Eden is still quite present. That is to say that paradoxically there is a form of anonymity because there is a massification, but in a positive sense. That is to say, you no longer feel that you are you as an individual but more a member of a group, and so the singular look, I would say, disappears. And after, that's for the look in general. After for the look, let's say, of predation or desire, but in the negative sense. That is to say, not to look but to watch. That is also linked to the naturist culture which is not extended at all to understand that there were displaced looks. That when you looked at someone with insistence, in fact, you were already trampling on his freedom, on his space, etc. Because the look is not just the eyes that stay here, the look is a ray, so the insistent look is exactly like a hand on the butt. It's the same order. There is something intrusive, and that is really very present in the naturist culture, because anarchists. Also in the early 20th century, there were a lot of women, feminist anarchists. The history of anarchism and feminism are very linked, and so there are 5,060 years of advance on these issues, also in the naturist villages, and so the work on the look has been done for a long time. And then there is one last thing when you watch the film. I don't know if you saw it. Une seule histoire by Jean Eustache. It's a film about a perverted man who watches a woman undressing during the film, and then he looks at her through the hole of a lock. And in fact, what creates the excitement is that we feel that the nudity of the woman is something completely abstract. It is hidden. There is something of the order of transgression. It creates desire, and the whole film is about that. And there it turns out that the people who are in the naturist villages know what the body of a woman looks like. The body of a man, the aspect of transgression disappears, and so the need for look also disappears quite naturally. Once you have seen 50 different sexes, you don't look at them anymore because the body is used to it. There is no more folklore around the sex, around the body of others.
How does desire subsist? Because you say that desire often comes from what we don't have access to, but how will a seduction materialize between two people? A young man who is attracted by a woman or a woman who is attracted by a man, or in cases or situations between two people of the same sex, how will this seduction be created and how will desire subsist?
It's fascinating because paradoxically by dressing up, desire is present, but it is present at certain times of the day. And often it is in the evening, and in the evening we dress up, and we create a form of flirtatiousness, because suddenly we are hidden. And generally, the moment of seduction, it comes at that moment. And I think it's pretty great precisely that there are moments for seduction, which is not always the case in society or in public space. There is this kind of blur. Whereas here, during the day, everyone is having fun, which does not mean that you do not have a potential desire for one or the other. It does not matter. But it is in the evening that it can be expressed, at a time when coquetry comes back through clothing. And that's why all the criticisms around impudence, etc., seem to me to be really misplaced. Because precisely when you try to be sexy, when you try, you never undress. In fact, you will use the clothes, even if it is lingerie, etc. Everyone knows that hiding is what will create seduction. Because of the mystery, because of the desire to undress, the imagination, etc., so it is played at that moment.
Is it a disappearance of modesty or a transformation of it? Is there still something that can be called modesty?
Yes, completely. But precisely I think there is really an incomprehension of what modesty is. Because when we say in fact we are all naked in the family, etc. So for example, we will see one of our parents naked. It's impolite to show yourself naked. In fact, for me, it's an incomprehension. It's rather indecent. Because there is a distinction to make between what is of the order of decency, that is to say, the social norms around what is good, not good, pudic, impudic, and the modesty, which has nothing to do with it, which is something very personal and which is very imaginative, and coquetry and prudery, which is still a lot of other things because we often confuse a form of prudishness with a modesty, so to speak, of virtue. For me, impudence is when you reveal yourself to the other when the other does not want it. Basically because it's a form of exhibitionism. But for example, a speech about oneself can be much more impudent than nudity, which in fact reveals absolutely nothing. When I'm naked in a naturist village, I don't feel like it's my intimacy that's being revealed. On the contrary, I feel like the others don't see how I dress. Whereas when they see how I dress, they see that I make a choice. If I choose to wear larger clothes, it's because suddenly it indicates that I'm sick in my skin, etc. So nudity in itself reveals nothing. And I think that the border between modesty and impudence is rather a question of attitude, of without embarrassment. For example, you can very well be naked, and the way you walk, etc., can be prudish or impudish. You can decide to be like that, with your legs spread out, whether you are dressed or naked. For me, it's imputish, you see? While there can be modesty, including in nudity. So I think it's linked to an incomprehension of what is the order of intimacy. Nudity and intimacy are completely different things. By the way, when you want to enter someone's intimacy, you read their diary, you don't take their shirt off. I think...
What is intimacy for you?
Intimacy is precisely what reveals the other. And in my opinion, it goes much more through what you say. For example, when you're in front of the camera, it's much more intimate. For me, it can be much more intimate to talk to someone than to undress. So it's the place where you reveal yourself. And for me, it doesn't go through nudity.
You mentioned the Garden of Eden earlier, with Adam eating the fruit of the meadows. Is there this desire to break with the original sin in the naturist tradition? Or is there this imaginary that comes back?
In any case, what is true is that in the Christian imagination, and Western societies are still very imbued with the Christian imagination, the shame linked to the body is linked, even unconsciously, to the idea of the original sin. Because Adam and Eve started dressing up after Eve had eaten the apple. So there is a link between the clothes and shame and the original sin. And indeed, naturists untie this link between shame and nudity. But where they are looking for So there is an Edenic imagination in naturist villages, because often we are in nature, so in terms of purely pictorial symbolism, it looks like it. But where there is a fundamental difference is that in naturism, we do not seek to return to a pre-political or prehistoric state, in the sense that the original sin would be the beginning of history. On the contrary, as naturism is a counterculture, and moreover, born of anarchism, as I said, political consciousness is very important. So, from that point of view, it is not an Edenic imagination at all. I don't know if I'm clear.
And is there something that has a lot more to do with, for example, Rousseau's state of nature?
Well, it's a bit of the same order. Of course, there is this imagination, but at the same time, the state of nature in Rousseau is also an apolitical and pre-political state, even chronologically. While in naturism, there is this Edenic or Rousseauist imagination, but totally post-political, since naturism would not have existed without the Industrial Revolution. So naturism cannot be understood without capitalism and without politics. I think it's important to keep that in mind to understand the political, historical character, and also the claim to be a counterculture, and not at all a society like the societies of the First Nations, for example, the Native Americans, etc. It's completely in our order.
What is the reception of religions in the naturist movement? Because a lot of naturists have faith. How do we live our faith, those who have it, with naturism?
Well, it's true that today's naturists, when we look at it sociologically, are rather people who were from the 1860s, so they were from a really hyperlaic left. And often anti-Christian and anti-religious in general. And also very hostile to dualism between the body and the spirit, which is often a hobby of philosophers, but because these philosophers were Christian or religious. For example, my uncle and my aunt, whom I speak of in Vivre Nuit, they bought the house from a pastor. For Protestants, the relationship to dualism is a little different, because they consider that Jesus is a figure of incarnation, and therefore we cannot consider that the body is sinful, because otherwise God would not have made himself man in the person of Jesus and in the flesh of Jesus. For example, for Protestants, it's a little different, and in these cases we consider that there is a possible reconciliation between practicing naturism and one's Protestant faith. And besides, it turns out that the countries where naturism develops the most are countries of Protestant culture, but also because there is this reconciliation between theological or philosophical theological principles, the monism of the Protestants, and the experience of naturism. So I would say that there are both.
So I imagine that the fact, indeed, I was going to ask you about this, on the fact that naturism is more shared in Protestant countries, is the fact that it is still a movement that is rather Western. Is it related to religious and cultural issues, or? Is it precisely because this relationship to industry and the Industrial Revolution is more Western?
Yes, I think it's more related to that. That is to say that naturism is historically explained by the secularization movement and by a violent reaction to the consequences of massive industrialization. And it turns out that for the moment, Western societies are the ones that know the most about secularization movements. That is, the theocracy is still several centuries old, and also for whom the Industrial Revolution is already 150 years old. So I think it's more related to that.
I would like to come back to something you said earlier on gender relations. Yes. Could you explain a little more? How do they transform themselves into naturalist villages? How does it evolve?
The logic, to understand it, is really the logic of equality that I talked about earlier. That is to say, the idea that behind nudity, the political vocation was to be able to make sure that a priest speaks equally with the seamstress, with the master of the work and with the miller. This logic applies to other things. That is to say that when you go to a naturalist village, for example, I am 27 years old today. In naturalist villages, I can speak to a 60-year-old man. I speak to someone, I don't speak to a 60-year-old man. And if he is an architect, for example, I will never know that he is an architect, because the question, what do you do in life too, is very secondary. So the relationships with people and the barriers that exist in society and in the metropolises between people generally disappear. And it's the same thing. I say that because the relationships between generations and class relationships, if they are complicated, it is because there is a logic of domination, and it is this same logic of domination between men and women that disappears. In naturalist villages, in this same logic, in my opinion, it is the same thread. And how does this explain itself? In my opinion, by a form of shared vulnerability that does not exist in the public space. Because a naked man, well, already a priori, it is a man who does not bandage, who himself has complexes, who is in his natural state for once. And this shared vulnerability means that for once, the man is a bit of a woman like the others. In any case, it is the feeling that it gives. And that on the feminine side, I speak for my case. In fact, we are not at all afraid of a man who is naked. We are afraid of a man because the way he dresses, in fact, will refer to this symbol of domination. And so this shared vulnerability also allows much more fluid, much more spontaneous relationships, and which benefit women, and which are also a huge relief for men themselves. For all those who do not correspond exactly to the criteria of alpha male, for example, it is a source of absolute liberation, in my opinion.
Isn't there a form of hypocrisy in our societies when it comes to clothing, when we are going to consider nudity as impudence, while we are going to sacralize hypersexualization? You just have to take the subway to see advertisements where there is really an objectification of the sets. Isn't it hypocritical not to accept a naked person? And yet glorify the clothing, and we go back to what we were saying, the provocative clothing, if I may say so.
Yes, it is very hypocritical. But at the same time, when we say that there is a paradox between a return among young people, a form of pettiness that seems very anachronistic, and a form of extreme pornography, for example on social networks, the two cohabit. In fact, this is not at all a paradox. The two feed each other. When the most prudish societies are the societies that sexualize women's bodies the most, since precisely the best way to sexualize a woman's body is to hide it to the extreme. Because when you hide it, you create everything that creates desire, that is to say the feeling of being forbidden, the sense of transgression, etc. So from that point of view, there is an internal logic that seems very hypocritical to me, but where both need each other to exist, that's for sure.
And to finish, I have a more personal question. How does it change our relationship to the five senses, to nudity, to sharing? How do we live? Because clothing can also protect us from water, sand, from a lot of things. How is it going to change or enhance, or not?
the first thing I thought about was the notion of vulnerability. I think, for example, that I did not have an obvious ecological education, and the fact of growing up in naturalist villages, of being naked, so for example, to feel directly nature in what it can also have of violent. When there is a storm, when suddenly it starts to rain, when you go swimming, and you are not wearing a shirt, you are all naked, and there are jellyfish. The relationship to nature is a much more frivolous relationship, where we have a feeling of alternity and adversity. Everything becomes much more hostile. It's the expression, but clothing protects a lot of this type of sensation. And so I think we can have a projection capacity on the fragility of nature itself, much more important when we are naked ourselves, and we have nothing to protect us. So, for example, from this point of view, the ecological consciousness becomes much more obvious. Because, for example, as with almost everything, we know that smoking kills, but we stop smoking when we have a parent who has cancer, much more than when we just theoretically know that smoking kills. And there it is a bit of the same order. That is to say that we know that nature is vulnerable, we know that it undergoes a lot of aggression, but that all of a sudden we find ourselves, because like an animal, because we are animals, in nature, in a situation of vulnerability without clothing, the projection capacity and therefore empathy towards nature is much more important. So that's for the more political part. And then there is just a sensory part, where we realize that we are in extremely cultured societies, but it is voluntarily a neologism, and that the relationship to our sensations is still a very distant relationship, and that we find ourselves spending summers in nature, where all of a sudden the relationship to noise, the relationship to touch, in any case, is doubled. And that is also an experience that, in itself, outside of history, outside of politics, outside of everything, justifies going to experience naturism, because life is much richer, and that we may need much less distraction or entertainment in the Pascalian sense to feel alive. In fact, it is the slogan of naturists in the 1930s, it is to feel alive, and for me, it speaks to me a lot.
When I listen to your passionate speech, I say to myself, isn't it difficult for you to put your clothes back on when you leave the naturist village?
Yes. But since it is difficult for anyone who is 15 years old to come back from a holiday village, but at the same time, when you go out, you realize how precious it was. And I hope to be a bit plural, so I have other things to do elsewhere. But I'm always happy to come back, that's for sure.
To conclude, I would like to ask you to share with our listeners a book, a cartoon, or a book of advice. It can be a movie, it can be an exhibition, it can be a lot of things. A cultural resource that you would advise.
I'm going to keep it simple. I never know how to say my favorite book, my favorite movie, because as soon as I see a new one that I like, it takes the place of the other. So I will advise the last book, which is called Un Bonheur Parfait, which is a book by an American, whose name is James Salter, and which is translated to Rock Editions. It's a great book, as the Americans like to do, and I know I like to give this kind of advice because it's a plural book, so it can please a lot of people, because it has a saga side. It's a bit like the book world. It's very popular books. There are a lot of characters. There is a psychological work on each of the characters. It's not like a learning novel, where you follow a guy. Rastignac, we'll come back to that. It's a popular book, but where each character has its own evolution. So, as a psychological novel, I find it very strong.
Un Bonheur Parfait. Thank you very much, Margaux Cassan, for accepting our invitation. We really recommend all your books. We put all the links in the description. They allow us to forge a reflection. Thank you.
Thank you.